Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Ghost Riders. Story number 1. A cowboy sat on impatient horses squinting through the blazing mid-afternoon light at the lone farmhouse on the plain. They were sore, tired, and in bad humor, each of them festering over the ugly truth of the upcoming months. A long stretch of hard, dusty days, which would end only after they had driven their herd of 3,000 Texas Longhorn to the stockyards in Abilene, Kansas. But at the thought of the trail ahead, did little to cheer their prickly dispositions. The sight of the small wooden house before them roused an even uglier ire. Farmers and cowboys were natural enemies during the early days of the range. Cattlemen depended on the unobstructed expanse of the plains to drive their herds from their grazing grounds in Texas to Kansas cattle towns. But ambitious homesteaders saw the same tract as potential farmland. Frontier farmers who fenced off their plots not only deprived cowboys of grazing land for their cattle, but they also obstructed the movement of the Texan herds north. So as far as these 8 cowboys were concerned, the innocent-looking farmhouse on the bank of Texas Neches River was a personal attack on their livelihood. The 8 men looked at the solitary farmhouse for long moments as the enormous herd of cattle gathered behind them. 4 more cowboys rode up from the rear of the herd, their bandanas tied up around their faces and their clothes caked with dust and sweat. "What's the holdup?" one of the 4 riders asked. The trail boss put his tobacco into the Neches River and nodded at the homestead ahead. "Looks like some sodbuster decided to set up." 2 or 3 of the cowpunchers uttered curses under their breaths. Another man fiddled with the handle of his shooting iron. "Well, what the hell are we going to do about this?" one of the masked riders asked the trail boss. "This man's fence goes as far as I can see." "Damn these dirt diggers," the wrangler next to the trail boss growled as he looked down the length of the fence. "I reckon we ought to teach this man a lesson." The cowboys were silent, dwelling over fantasies of punishment when the farmer came striding out of his home. Obviously scared and angry, the man was brandishing a double-barrel Remington and spouting all sorts of unflattering epithets at the cattlemen, promising the worst to each and every one if they didn't turn their herd around. None of the riders were in the least bit impressed by the show of bravado. The desperation boiling beneath was all too apparent. They stared through the fence at the livid farmer for a few moments longer before the trail boss gave his order. "Let's run this fool over." Flicking the reins of his horse, the trail boss cast one look at the men in his outfit before galloping to the back of the herd. Not one of them hesitated. Taking their positions around their cattle, the cowboys quickly whipped the herd into an agitated frenzy. The farmer, realizing what was about to happen, ran back into his home, desperately urging his family to get out, but by then it was too late. Next moment, the entire herd burst through the farmer's fence. The homesteader emerged from his house again and managed to empty both barrels of his shotgun into the oncoming stampede just before he was trampled. The herd went over him and stormed toward his one-room farmhouse, where his wife and 2 children were huddled together in terror, their whispered supplications to a merciful God drowned out by the roar of the stampeding beasts. When the herd hit the house, beams, planks, and glass came apart like so many cards and matchsticks. In a few short minutes, the entire homestead was reduced to a flattened pile of debris. None survived. According to legend, not one of the cowboys expressed an iota of remorse at this inhuman deed. They arrived in Abilene early that fall, whooping it up with the rest of the Texas cowpunchers at trail's end. Some of them even bragged about the incident to their Confederates, throwing back whiskey and laughing about the look on the plowman's face when their steers crashed through his fence. It became the story of the season around the saloons that year, providing the men of that outfit with a morbid cachet among many of their hard-hearted companions. Staying on in Abilene for just over a month, the cowboys remained until the awe and envy lavished on them by their fellow Texans began to thin out. By October, most cowpunchers had gone back to their southern ranches, and Abilene suddenly resembled a slightly overpopulated ghost town. It was then when the cowboys packed up and headed home themselves. that they became aware of the price of their atrocious glory. Hailed as heroes in Abilene for 1 month, in 1870, the cowboys of that cursed outfit would never enjoy another peaceful moment after they crossed back into their home state. For the rest of their days they were haunted by horrible visions and nightmares. Terrifying herds of angry bulls with burning eyes, smoking nostrils, and sharpened horns stampeded through their dreams, leaving a cloud of burning dust along a blood-red Neches River. The dead family, decomposed and mutilated, often appeared right in front of them during waking hours, standing silently for a few moments before vanishing into thin air as quickly as they came. The repeated appearance of these phantasms made the once stalwart cowpunchers into a group of quivering wretches. Unable to work another cattle drive, none of them lived long enough after their return to Texas in 1870. Within 5 years, all of them were dead. Causes of death varied from gunfights to suicide. One man drank himself into death, throwing back the harshest rotgut he could find until his body just gave up. Another suddenly and inexplicably, unable to stomach any morsel of food, simply stopped eating. The trail boss, his pale face frozen into a look of absolute horror, was found face down on the left bank of the Neches River, near the former homestead of the farmer they had killed. What had brought the trail boss to the scene of the crime? What terrifying entity had killed him without leaving so much as a mark? The last cowboy in the outfit died in 1875. Not long after that, the Ghost Riders began to appear on the Neches River. Specifics of their first appearance have been lost over the years. No one can say what was the date or who had been seen them first, but the sighting itself has been preserved countless times in the local folklore. They came just as the sun was sinking low on the horizon, when the immense Texan sky was a scarlet-streaked dome and the Neches ran red like a river of blood to the southeast. It may have been a lone local testing the waters with a fishing rod. Perhaps it was a group of ranch hands taking a walk with a bottle of hooch after a hard day of roping and branding. Whoever it was, we can only imagine the reaction when the ground beneath began to rumble and the whole landscape started to shake. Up above on the southern horizon, a group of what looked to be thick red clouds suddenly appeared, moving north at great speed. In the span of a few seconds, the clouds were overhead, were no longer clouds, but a herd of angry cattle, driven forward by 12 masked cowboys. They roared over the Neches River in a terrible rush, the whole landscape shaking in their wake, and then in the next instant they were gone. They vanished suddenly in the dim evening sky, leaving not a trace of their passing. Since that first appearance in 1875, the Ghost Riders of the Neches River have been spotted at least once every summer. Witnessed by thousands of people over the decades, the Ghost Riders have become one of Texas' most enduring folk tales. In 1915, country singer Stan Jones immortalized them in his classic song, Ghost Riders in the Sky. And as years have gone by, the general public has largely forgotten the riders' ugly origins. Today, the Ghost Riders are associated more with their amazing natural spectacle than their dark past. Nevertheless, it is the curse of their evil past that has kept them coming to the Neches River year after year. Their crimson appearance against the setting sun is nothing less than unholy condemnation. And as long as the Ghost Riders continue to appear, we know that somewhere the riders continue to pay the price for their earthly iniquities. Next story. The legend of Stampede Mesa takes us back to the fall of 1889 among the cottonwoods, curly mesquite, and sagebrush of Crosby County, Texas, where a group of cowboys was gathering an enormous herd of 1,500 longhorn together after another grueling day on the trail. The cowboys guided their herd atop a mesa that was well known among local cowpunchers as an ideal spot for northward bound cattle drives. A 200-acre plateau covered in lush grass. The mesa was bordered to the south by a sheer cliff that dropped over 100 feet into the White River below. The natural barrier allowed outfits that bedded down here to cut their night guard in half, giving the cowboys a few extra hours of sorely needed rest. The mesa top had been used by trail crews as a resting ground for as long as herds were being driven north out of Texas. Tired, hungry, and grimy, the cowboys and their herd arrived at the mesa just as the sun was slipping below the western horizon. The end of their day in sight, the cowboys were salivating at the idea of beans, bacons, and bedrolls as they rolled up into the plateau. That was before they saw the rickety old cowpuncher, who was already camped there, watching over a tiny herd of 40 emaciated steers. The arriving cowboy outfit was just as thrilled about seeing this small-time rancher as he was about seeing them. The old man promptly began cursing as the approaching cattle swamped the area, turning the two separate herds into one enormous mass of cattle. "You damn fools!" the old man roared at the approaching riders, surprising them with a gust of his fury. "No one's resting a heartbeat till we cut my doggies out of that mess." The trail boss looked from the confusion of animals around them to the weary faces of his cowboys, to the indignant man who was standing staring up at them with a scowl on his face and his arms akimbo. "Ain't gonna happen tonight, old-timer," the trail boss said. "Me and my boys are way too beat to be sorting out steers. We'll look after it in the morning." "Like hell you will," the old man shot back. "I ain't planning on getting a late start tomorrow just 'cause you boys can't finish your day." By now the entire outfit was pulled up around them. 9 tired men who had been in the saddle for about 4 hours too long that day. "I reckon you didn't hear me right, friend," the cowboy responded, again a trace of menace in his voice. "We'll clear up this mess in the morning. This day overwork's over." The solitary cowpoke was about to bark back, but he was silenced by the sound of pistol hammers cocking. Suddenly, finding himself standing at the wrong end of many shooting irons, the old man swallowed his anger. "I assume we understand each other now," the trail boss said. "If there's anything else you want to say, I'm free after supper." That ended the discussion. The old man glowered at the trail drivers as he stormed off, disappearing into the thick herd of animals as the cowboys dismounted and began setting up camp. None of the cowboys saw the lone rancher while they were eating, and he still hadn't returned to his camp when those men, not on first watch, settled down in their bedrolls. Not that it really mattered to the exhausted trail drivers, who were too tired to think about where the old man was, let alone talk about him. By the time the first handful of stars appeared in the sprawling Texas sky, the outfit was a snoring circle of comatose cowboys. That was, until a dreadful rumbling sound woke them in the middle of the night. The same word flashed through the mind of each of the cowboys: stampede. They dashed for their horses as the ground shook and the enormous herd roared towards them from somewhere in the darkness. Leaping into their saddles, the trail drivers desperately tried to corral their stampeding herd. Caught unawares by the sudden rush and barely able to see in the pitch darkness, they stood next to no chance of averting the disaster that was about to transpire. Each of the cowpunchers was dreadfully aware that the cattle were stampeding south towards the 100-foot drop-off into the White River. They were all imagining the horrific scene as it played itself out just beyond their sight. Hundreds upon hundreds of Texas longhorn plunged from the mesa cliff to certain death below. The stampede had taken a terrible toll on the herd by the time it had run itself out. All but 300 cattle had fallen over the edge of the mesa. Down at the base of the cliff, a gory mess of thousands of pulverized animals was draining into the White River. Among these lost steers were the bodies of 2 dead cowboys who had been swept over the side while trying to head off the stampeding herd. For a long while, the surviving trail drivers were only able to fester in mute shock, unable to come to terms with what had just happened. Finally, the trail boss spoke up, his voice a tense chord strung out between rage and grief. "The sky is clear, and there ain't a trace of storm on the wind. What the hell made 'em bolt?" "Could have been a gang of Comanche," one of the cowboys offered, "or maybe a rattler got 'em spooked." "Wasn't no stinking Comanche," another cowboy said from the darkness. "Wasn't no snake, prairie dog, or elephant either. I saw who did it. It was that blasted old man. I saw him waving a blanket and whooping away on the north end of the mesa. He got the cattle going before I could stop him." "You're foolin'," the trail boss said, incredulous. "No, I ain't. It was that old cowpuncher. I saw him. Man must be right loco to do a thing like this." "Makes no difference to me what he is," the trail boss barked. "You ride out right now and find that vermin. Bring him back alive. He's going to pay for what happened here tonight." With that, the cowhands galloped north in pursuit of the man who was responsible for wiping out their herd and killing 2 of their number. The old man didn't give much of a chase. The horsemen caught up to him before he crossed the White River. Riding down on him with murder in their eyes, the cowboys promptly captured him and brought him back to their camp atop the mesa. Pleading his innocence, the entire time the old man's words fell on deaf ears. "What you boys gonna do?" the petrified captive asked of the gathered cowboys. "Well, I reckon we should send you after those steers you got so ornery about, old-timer," the trail boss answered. "What do you think?" The poor man was silenced with a gag before he was able to answer. They then bound his hands behind his back and wrapped a blindfold around his head. Blindfolding his horse next, the cowboys then drove the man and his mount forward. Sightless, man and beast went forward for a few dozen feet before they hit the edge of the cliff. In another moment they were gone, vanishing off the mesa in the dim light of the early morning. The riders took off soon after that, taking the paltry remnants of their shattered herd with them. But the mesa they left behind would never be the same. No cattle outfit would ever again feel right staying at the once popular resting spot. Rumors began circulating among cattlemen in the region, stories of bizarre and inexplicable events that set cowboys and the cattle they guarded on edge. Entire herds of steers would become restless on the mesa top. More than once, cowboys resting on the mesa for the night would have to think fast when their herds suddenly and without any apparent cause began stampeding for the southern cliff. If not for the skill and bravery of a few cowboys, the 1889 disaster may have been repeated more than once. No longer desirable stopping place for trail outfits, the mesa acquired a dark reputation among Texan ranchers. They took to calling it Stampede Mesa, moniker for both the tendency it evoked among resting cattle and the unfortunate legend of its provenance. If most trail outfits avoided Stampede Mesa, as a matter of practicality, few trail drivers gave the legend too much thought. One night, say that the men born of the hard ranching culture of Texas tended to be not too talkative about these sorts of matters, and anyone who brought up the legend of Stampede Mesa around a bar or a campfire would likely either get laughed at or cussed out. Nevertheless, there were cowboys whose experience atop Stampede Mesa would make them clam up whenever members of their rough fraternity scoffed at the legend. Men who experienced deeply disturbing things while riding the night guard over their herds. Some swore they saw a glimmering apparition of a blindfolded man galloping up and down the northern line on a phantom mount and produced a blood-curdling shriek as he went, scaring the cattle into a stampede. Other cowboys would say when they were in company they could trust that they saw an entire herd of ghostly cattle charging south across the mesa. Their movement made no sound, but the moment this phantom herd passed through the live cattle, the living animals would suddenly surge southward along with the dead. There was good reason then to avoid Stampede Mesa. The open range didn't last for too many years after 1889, and as ever fewer cattle drivers made their way past the storied plateau, warnings of the strange goings-on atop the mesa were heard less and less. That isn't to say, however, that the tale of Stampede Mesa was forgotten completely, for even though traffic past the mesa subsided over the years, the phantom herd and its ghostly caretaker still haunts the 200-acre stretch of Texas upland. Nocturnal sightings on Stampede Mesa continue to this very day. Some witnesses have corroborated the old legend, speaking of seeing the silvery form of a blindfolded old man atop a galloping horse moving with unearthly speed across the mesa. In the past, these accounts have mostly come from Crosby County youth, often from young men driving out to the mesa at night, looking for thrills, their wild cavorting cut short by the sight of the spectral rider tearing across the landscape, howling madly at the southern cliff that he was driven over so many years ago. Others claim to have witnessed another sort of phenomena on Stampede Mesa. This one more awe-inspiring than appalling. It happens only on certain fall evenings, when the sun is low on the western horizon and the clouds have scarlet plumes and streaks across an especially dazzling western sky. It is then that an enormous herd of Russian cattle appears amongst the clouds right over Stampede Mesa. They remain visible for only a few minutes, as long as it takes them to traverse the distance of the plateau and vanish back into the clouds. And just before they disappear, the sounds of a screaming man drifts in as if heard from a great distance, like an echo on the wind. Next story. The particulars of this folk tale have been lost over the years. Forgotten are the names of the two cowboys lost on the snow-swept expanse of Park County, Wyoming. No one can say for sure when and even where the event took place. only that it occurred during an especially cruel winter sometime in the last century, on a secluded stretch of ranch land. Yet the tale has been told and retold so many times, passed from person to person, generation to generation, around campfires and books and in newspapers, that it stands as one of Wyoming's most time-tested legends, having been around nearly as long as the cowboy himself. For the sake of the story, we'll call the two cowpunchers John and Bill. What is known about the pair is that one of them, Bill, was an older, more experienced hand, and John was a young greenhorn who had just earned his spurs. The two men were assigned as line riders on the outer borders of their ranch for the winter. In the days before barbed wire, the responsibility fell on cowpunchers to patrol the perimeters of their employers' ranches during the winter months, ensuring that no cattle strayed too far looking for shelter or pasture. It was tough work, riding long distances between wintering stations for the duration of the season. Ranch hands often had to brave raging blizzards and fierce temperatures on this extended sentry duty. For many cowboys, this border patrol was made worse by loneliness, as many ranch bosses assigned solitary patrols, condemning a few unfortunate cowboys to complete isolation for the entire season. Luckily for John and Bill, their ranch boss wasn't so cruel. Youngster and veteran were given the patrol duty together, and for the first few months of their line riding tenure, things went smoothly. Well, as smoothly as could be expected for such a fierce winter. It was one of the hardest seasons anyone could remember, with temperatures dipping below negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit and snowdrifts piling up over 6 feet high. The men were hard-pressed to make their rounds, often losing their way and consistently arriving at their ranch station several hours late, frozen, tired, and hungry. A few could endure deprivation and difficulty like the early American cowboy, and both John and Bill bore the harsh conditions with the mythic stoicism of their kind. Working steadily through November-December without any incident, the pair soon found the monotony of their assignments as much of a challenge as the harsh climate. They gave up any attempts at conversation after the first month of work, and the snow-logged days quickly blended into one another, turning the days and weeks into a blurred mishmash of unpleasant sensations. Hours on the trails were marked by how numb face and fingers were. Living cattle that bore their ranch's brand were herded back to where they belonged. Dead cattle were skinned for their hides. Wolves were shot on sight. Everything was proceeding with mind-numbing repetition until one January morning, when Bill was woken by especially fierce winds screaming through the tiny log station he and John had bedded in the night before. "Listen to that," the old man muttered to himself, shaking off his sleep. "It must be really coming down out there." Their quarters were so small that he didn't have to get out of bed to open the door. Reaching for the door handle, Bill gasped at the sight that greeted him when he pulled the portal open. It was the worst blizzard he had ever seen in all his days in the saddle. "Damn, what the hell are we doing about this?" The sudden blast of cold air woke John. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, the young man stared out the open door and let out a low whistle. "We got one hell of a ride ahead of us today, old-timer. Make no mistake." Bill got up to close the door, having to lean heavily against the wind to latch it shut. He lit the kerosene lamp in the tiny cabin and looked at his young companion. "I don't know if we're going anywhere today. Might be best to just sit tight and wait till it blows over. Looks mighty mean out there." These were more words than the man had spoken in the last month. John stared doubtfully at his bearded companion. In the dim kerosene glow, he looked more grizzly bear than man. "Gotta be kidding me," the cowpuncher snorted in response. "Stay in this shack for the day? I'll go stir crazy, shucks.